Hello, and welcome to the Further podcast, where we explore the far reaches of the human experience, from missions to Mars to skydiving to blowing one's mind with psychoactive substances. These conversations offer insight into how these extreme experiences showcase the human spirit and just might teach us how to live our everyday lives a bit better. I'm your host, Haley Maria Duran, and I study the effects of psychedelics and other out-there experiences on people's minds and brains. So, have you ever wondered why people on ayahuasca make such a big deal about vomiting? Why is there this whole complex about purging? I guess it could be in part because people have what Dan Grossman likes to call somatic experiences on psychedelics. And it's not exclusive to ayahuasca, although that's probably the most obvious example. If you've ever had randomly started shaking on psychedelics or something like that, this also could be considered a somatic release experience. And I really appreciate how Dan Grossman digs into this topic because it's so easy to ignore it when psychedelics are producing such mind-bending effects, mystical experiences, ego dissolution, all of that, to get caught up in the cognitive dimension of experience instead of focusing on people's bodily responses. But Dan has a lot of interesting data to suggest that these more physical aspects might play a big role in people's healing as well. So I really enjoyed interviewing Dan. Dan is at UAB right now. And I remember we were talking about his dissertation project a couple of years ago now. And he was leaning between studying somatic experiences with psychedelics and doing a more, I guess you would say, normie psychedelic project. And I'm very glad that he picked this project, and I think he is too. We get to talk about rainbow body and chakras, and yet I'm not cringing because he is just describing people's experiences during psychedelics. So some good phenomenology here, and also history of somatic experiences, which I was surprised to learn just how far back the West's interest in somatic experiences entwined with psychology go back, because I don't know, I kind of had heard of things like Chinese medicine and all of that before, so I was like, oh, there's some Eastern stuff going on there, but man, Dan is knowledgeable about some of the early history of studying somatic experiences within the context of psychoanalysis, of all things. So I really enjoyed this episode. We have a new book club coming up. We're reading Flow by Csikszentmihalyi, and we will be meeting February 15th. So check that out if you're interested. If you don't read the whole book and you just want to come for the vibes, do that. It's fine. Our last meeting, a good number of people had not read the book, and we still had a great time. So yeah, stay tuned for more episodes coming up. All right, so I am here with Dan Grossman. I knew Dan from when I was working at UAB, and we were both in the same lab with Peter Hendricks, and Dan has been doing some really fascinating and innovative and much needed work examining how psychedelics can provoke somatic experiences and what this might mean for people. So it's kind of an obscure topic in a lot of ways, but I think it intersects with a lot of things people find interesting. So maybe to get us started, you could tell us a bit about why you're even looking at this.
Sure. So, well, firstly, thank you for having me on, Haley. It's an honor to be here. So I guess in my mind, before I got into psychedelic research, I kind of thought of myself as like an embodiment researcher. I spent a few years before starting my PhD with Peter, kind of just, well, for one, I was working in a lab that was looking at sort of like alternative like mind-body interventions for PTSD. That was at the Boston VA. And kind of during that time, I was teaching myself more about like the neuroscience of interoception, and which I found to be a very interesting topic and sort of one of the kind of major frontiers of neuroscience and also like mental health treatment, because it's got so many associations with different kinds of psychopathology and disease. Like it's just such an important topic. But I mean, even before that, the question was, how did I get interested in the subject? I guess I could start being like a freshman in college when I made a friend who was kind of into Buddhist philosophy. And he introduced me to this place called the American Yoga Foundation, which is in the Catskill Mountains of New York. And I spent a summer there and sort of, they have a particular sort of style of yoga that they teach. And that was sort of my introduction to mindfulness and Buddhist philosophy. But also, I kind of picked up some ideas there around sort of how our bodies are kind of shaped by like cultural conditioning and experiences like trauma and stress over time kind of accrue. And yes, they like influence our attitudes and our beliefs, but they also shape how we physically carry ourselves. And and so I learned some practices there that were kind of meant to like sort of directly address that sort of from the bottom up. Like in my field, like in psychology, we have tools for sort of like addressing people's like beliefs and helping them kind of develop insight and maybe more awareness of their emotions, but it's generally very top down. Like we really go at it using sort of like verbal intellectual functions, but like our organism is so much more than that. Like before we were intellectual, like, verbal beings, we communicated with like grunts and like emotions and, physical acts. Like language is a much more evolved capacity. And I think there's a lot that's sort of happening below that level that my field hasn't really tapped into. I mean, it has like kind of more in like the alternative sort of circles, but like the mainstream of like academic or like medical psychology, I think very much has like a mind body duality problem. And so my interest in this subject, all of this is a very long way of saying that kind of prefaces my interest in like the somatic side of people's experiences on psychedelics. Like in some ways, I can see the potential for the field to kind of replicate some of that mind body dualism that kind of permeates psychology. And I think all the research on insight and cognition and changes in belief and mystical experience, like all of that is super important. And I'm glad we're doing it. But I do think there's this whole other dimension to people's experiences with psychedelics that we haven't really developed any studies of.
Yeah, it's strange to me that psychology and psychiatry have, in a lot of ways, just ignored the somatic aspects of people's experiences because you look at like the diagnostic criteria for something like depression or anxiety, and so much of it is somatic a lot of
Yeah.
times. And then people can also have those bigger somatic experiences with psychedelics or other sort of out there practices. I guess kind of going back a bit, how would you define a somatic experience?
It's a very broad term. And I think when we're talking about psychedelics, like, I actually think this is like a very complex topic. And like, my goal in doing this research wasn't to like provide a singular definition for what like a psychedelic somatic experience is. So I don't know if I would provide a definition for a somatic, because I think psychedelics, they affect the nervous system, like it's not just that like we have like altered perception. It's like they create somatic effects. Like we know that like autonomic activation occurs when you take a serotonergic psychedelic. That can be accompanied by sweating and like dilated pupils and like elevated heart rate and all these kinds of like somatic effects. So when you take a psychedelic, you're going to have a somatic experience. It's going to alter you at the somatic level. And I think that's true for basically any psychoactive drug that you take. But what I sort of did, at least for this study, was like focus on the sort of observable somatic responses for people, specifically like involuntary sort of reactions where it feels like the body is kind of acting in ways that are beyond my control. So that was kind of like our threshold, because like somatic experience is like so broad and does like an the component in everybody's psychedelic experience. Not everybody has this kind of like grossly somatic sort of response, where if I was in the room, I'd be like, oh, you're having some kind of reaction right now. Most of it is kind of subtler, maybe more apparent to the person who's having the experience. But I was interested in what happens when it gets to the point of like, I can see it.
So, just backing up a little more,
Yeah.
that's a very good academic definition, but what does this look like? Like
Yeah.
people having visible responses, like what
Yeah.
might a somatic experience appear
Yes.
as?
Lots of different things. I would say like the most common thing is like tremoring or shaking. I would say like most of my sample reported that at some point, typically sort of like during the come up, right? The experience is kind of intense. My body sort of shakes sometimes for intensity. Other people had different interpretations of that. Purging on ayahuasca. That's clearly observable. Someone vomiting into a bucket, you're not going to miss that. Sometimes emotional responses, but like it would often get like even stranger, like there was like sort of like spinal like undulation, sort of like almost like snake-like or serpentine movements. Spontaneous dance would happen where it really felt like people like their body would just start dancing in ways they didn't have control over. Vocalization was really common too. Sometimes like speaking in tongues that happened for some people. But also like spontaneously toning in different registers. Like a couple people reported that where it just felt like this kind of rising sort of urge to tone, like like in different sort of like vowel sounds and different sort of pitches and registers. And very often it's happening in ways that are surprising to the people that are experiencing it. So it's not like they go into it with sort of like a plan to have this experience. It's just like they experience the urge to express or vocalize or move in a certain way and sort of just allow that to take place.
Wild, weird, wacky stuff, man. Uh,
It is.
so, how did you find these people who are having such strange experiences? Or at least to me, it sounds a little strange.
It is strange. I mean, even to me, it's strange. And, I think it's like a life's work trying to make sense of these responses and like individual variation. It's different for different people and how they make meaning of it is different. But how did I find them? I mean, so my research really just I was just recruiting anybody. Like we went online and just like looked for anybody who'd used psychedelics therapeutically in the last year. So I kind of buried the lead on the sort of somatic piece of the study because we wanted to get sort of like a spectrum of people who've never had somatic experiences to people who've had like tons of them. I actually found that like, I mean, again, it's like an observable bodily response, like a response that I could have seen if I were in the room. Like that's a pretty broad category. Like most people have something involuntary happen during their session. So like 3/4 of the sample had at some point in their use of psychedelics experienced some kind of involuntary sort of bodily response. So it was pretty easy to find that. I think, but again, like that's a very broad definition. And like I'm hoping in like future sort of iterations of this work, maybe I can like have a more nuanced answer to that question. Like I think there are different like maybe types of somatic responses, and like that's kind of part of where I think this work is going, is like seeing if we can sort of better characterize what's happening, because of the intensity of the come up is different from having an experience where like it seems as if my body takes control and takes me out of my bed and then I start dancing in ways that feel like I'm like a puppet with strings. Like that's there's a lot in between those two experiences, like the grossly altered sense of agency versus the almost like reflexive shaking. You know what I mean? Like one feels more like a reflex in a way, and the other feels more like a coordinated response.
So, it sounds like you've stumbled onto a very large taxonomy of like possible experiences or varieties of what are some of the main things that people experience and like what kind of substances would provoke these experiences? Walk me through some examples.
So maybe I'll just back up really quick and just explain like the study sort of started with this kind of big online survey that was kind of just getting a sense on like do people vary on like stuff like body awareness or like emotional breakthrough based on sort of the quality of their somatic responses. And then for people who reported having those somatic responses, they had the potential to get invited for like a follow-up sort of in-depth interview. So I did in-depth interviews with 30 folks who reported at some point having in the last year having had this kind of observable bodily response. And so my answer to that sort of question is really based more on the phenomenological interviews. By far the most common, and the way I sort of sorted that data was trying to get a sense of like what kinds of stories did people tell about their somatic responses? Because I kind of felt like that was kind of the most like epistemically neutral way to kind of present the data, is like not to try to separate their interpretation from their experience, right? To just be like, okay, well, let's just take the whole thing and be like, this is the kind of story that they're telling about it. The most common one was what's sort of known in the psychedelic underground as somatic release. So that this sense that something in my body is sort of being purged through this somatic experience. So whether it's like shaking because, commonly sort of like trauma is being sort of released through the shaking. That's kind of one common explanation or interpretation people have. Or purging on ayahuasca, right? The sense that like the act of purging is itself something sort of in the body sort of coming out or being cleansed or purified or released. That was kind of the most common sort of story and kind of language people use to describe it. Like 28 out of 30, I think, of my participants at some point described their somatic experiences on those terms. But I mean, from there, I mean, it varied. Commonly, sometimes people were just like, yeah, I didn't make much of it. It was just kind of a side effect of having taken an enormous dose of mushrooms that like my body started to shake pretty profoundly because I was scared. That was very common. But it got like really interesting. I would say to me, one of the most provocative themes that came out of this was really the way in which the body becomes like a vehicle for meaning making itself. And you might have heard this in that talk I gave a couple weeks ago, but for example, like one participant, he reported that his body kind of had these like snake-like movements. But for him, this was like, he had this whole kind of like story about like having this like snake imagery in a dream he had a long time ago. And then it came up before his psilocybin session. And he understood this snake to kind of be like a rejection of his sexuality as a gay man, having grown up with like sort of conservative parents. He felt like he'd sort of cerebrally accepted his sexuality, but it wasn't really like an embodied acceptance. And for him, there was this moment during the psilocybin experience where it felt like this kind of snake image like entered into his body with sort of his language, and it animated his body. So his body started moving sort of involuntarily in this kind of serpentine movement. And for him, like that meant that this kind of repressed or rejected aspect of his sexuality was integrated at this kind of deeper level. So there's two things that come to me through that. One is that even though release was the most common, it's not the only thing that's happening here for sure. Like this to me feels like more like integrating something, right? So there was a sense that something was kind of being rejected, or some quality, aspect of his psyche was not really accepted. And it felt like through that sort of physical act, he was kind of enacting the acceptance of his sexuality at this deeper, sort of more embodied level. That's kind of for him. So it's a kind of a complicated theme, and I'm still trying to kind of get my head around it and make sense of it. But I think to me, what it reveals is the ways that psychedelics kind of seem to like break down this like mind body duality to a certain extent in a way that's like kind of obvious, in the sense that like they create all these synesthetic experiences. Like psychedelics don't really have much respect for like boundaries between domains. They sort of just like blur things together, and sights become sounds, and sounds become feelings, and feelings become sights. And I think this is sort of like one way into that sort of like general like blurring of boundaries, is that like mind and body and like meaning and physiology start to kind of blur together. And participants would even describe it in that language sometimes, that like they were enacting their psychological processes physically, that it was like the bodily component was just the physical side of whatever psychic process they were going through at that time. Whether it was like shedding layers of an old identity, and then their body would sort of act in a way that was in accordance with that, or integrating this kind of piece of their sexuality. Like that was kind of one of the more provocative themes. But it ranged like so much. I mean, I had like 9 different types of stories people would tell. Sometimes it was just like this ecstatic expression, almost like energetic, like orgasms, like that would sort of consume the whole body, and people would be like writhing in pleasure. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole family of things. This is, I mean, the way I usually describe this to people who ask about it is like, I feel like my job here has been to kind of like mark a trailhead, right? Like, I'm not gonna chart every single like twist and turn of this in one go, and probably not even in one lifetime. It felt a little like like kind of like waking up in the utility closet and then like exiting and being like, oh my God, this is like in a mansion, you know, like, it's kind of how it felt. Like, I thought I was studying just, like, these, like, release, like, somatic experiences, but then I get further into the data and I'm like, "No, there's this tremendous diversity of things that are happening here," and almost like this, architecture in some ways starts to come out where people are like, the language they're using to describe these experiences is just, like, not mapped in our field. I mean, it seems to align better with, like, concepts of like chakras and meridians from like traditional Chinese medicine and like Ayurveda. Which is not to say that I like endorse those models as being like accurate representations of what's happening here, but people are literally describing to me like channels of like energy and like blockages and like feeling at this like felt level that like something is kind of happening outside of their sort of conscious awareness. That the body's just like breaking up blockages and just moving stuff in ways that, yeah, they're almost like not really in control of. Like it's just kind of happening under the hood.
Well, that really underscores how much the body seems to play a role in people's psychological, like, well-being and state, and you just think about how, like you said earlier, with, like, psychology, everything's so mentally focused on, like, insight and all of that, and this is, like, saying, like, "No, we need to map out this other territory so that we can also heal people in this way." It's interesting what you say about, like, chakras, and I wonder how much of that was people being exposed to that language. If somebody's doing psychedelics, they might be a bit of a hippie out there, doing breath work or whatnot. At the same time, something like meridians and like Chinese medicine systems, they've stuck around for a while. So it almost makes me wonder if there is some underlying psychological truth to them.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a valid sort of question is like how much of people's sort of somatic experiences and how much of the stories they tell about them is sort of mediated by like exposures to these sorts of ideas and concepts. And yeah, for sure, like it somewhat is. I mean, the types of words people use to describe it, like that's how can you avoid the influence of culture and like how we structure the stories we tell. So I think it's a very valid sort of limitation. And I do think there's like a few things that I think sort of run counter to it, which is like there's very often this sense of surprise and discovery and sometimes even reluctance to use language like that. And again, like you have to take all of it with a grain of salt because I don't know what people's motives are when they decide to participate in a study like this. People who are just like, I wish I had other words for this, but energy is just like the most, like sort of consider myself more of like a materialist or whatever, but they find themselves sort of confounded by these experiences in some ways and end up reaching for languages that sort of like, yeah, that end up being sort of associated with sort of like woo woo, sort of alternative kind of subculture. But I think there's like a tendency. My view on that is like, I think we have a tendency to be like, there's a kind of epistemic like injustice, I think, that can creep in around this stuff. That just because things are sort of like poorly defined or sort of shrouded in like mysticism or esoterica that we then assume that it's pseudoscience and all a bunch of bogus, right? And often the people
Mm.
that really adopt those ideas are not very good advocates for them, right? Because I think like the kind of world of like vibes and the world of science, they don't really fit together that well. Like the vibey world is often very imprecise in how it terms different things, and science is often very precise. Like they just have this kind of opposite problem where one is very open-minded to the point where it lacks precision, and one can be so close-minded to the point where it misses like I don't know, like it can like I try to go for sort of like an open-minded empiricism, right? Like I'm not
Mm.
uncritically, despite my own exposures to ideas like this, like I do have an interest in like shaping this into be like a legitimate study of somatic experiences. And I don't think you get there by like uncritically adopting ideas about chakras and energy lines and stuff like that. But you also don't get there by just like outright denying the truth in what in people's stories here. Like I think there's a kind of epistemic injustice that gets done to this sort of thing. We want to kind of explain it all away as just being like, well, it's just your cultural predisposition or, whatever. But I think it's more than that. And I think the data that I have suggests that it probably is more than that there's not a one size fits all explanation for these phenomena. And I do think that there's some uncharted territory here. Like I'm convinced from looking at this data that like what people are describing and like the degree of precision with which they describe these experiences of like channels or lines or like kind of like currents of energy and stuff in their body, like there's a lot. It's not just like sloppy. Like they often, like one of them had this sort of like experience of vocalizing and like uses this very precise language of like feeling this kind of clear open pipe from the bottom of his abdomen up through his throat with a lot of volume and resonance. It sort of comes through in this very kind of like precise anatomical way. And another guy who's like describing this ibogaine experience as like almost feeling like it's like he could feel like his lymphatic system working, like sort of feeling like subtle kind of like currents moving through his body, like breaking up sort of clots, centering it into his stomach. And then he has this experience of purging almost involuntarily. He said it was like a cat horking up a hairball, just like and also feeling sort of the emotional quality of that experience. Like for him, it was like this ball of hate is the words he used to sort of describe it. So again, I think what's interesting about that too is like there's meaning and location and physicality. Like it's both emotion and psychological meaning, and also it has a location, right? It's in his gut. Like why? We don't have any concepts about that in the psychology that I was exposed to. Like we can't really say why he would have that experience. I just think it's interesting and it's I find them often in this position of it's an uncomfortable place to be when you're sort of standing on the fringe here where like, yeah, it does kind of open up to some sort of wacky, hard to measure, like unfalsifiable ideas about the body and energy body and rainbow body and all these kinds of like
Rainbow body.
yeah, you see this in like Buddhist scripture, like it's like I mean like the meditative traditions like abound with and yoga traditions abound with concepts like this. And like in some ways, like what I'm trying to do is like see if we can actually systematize a study of these phenomena that they report, which actually gets me to this that like this isn't really just about psychedelics. And I think you were maybe going to ask me about that later, which is that like there's this paper on like energy like experiences, somatic experiences in Western meditators that was done at Brown, I think like in 2021, maybe it was published. And the set of phenomena is virtually identical to what you see with the psychedelics. Some important differences, like people aren't like vomiting on meditation retreats, but they're vomiting in ayahuasca retreats. But like a lot of the stuff they're describing is basically the same. They describe these kinds of release-like experiences. They describe currents of energy, all of it. They describe the sort of altered sense of agency. So yeah, I mean, that to me is somewhat compelling evidence that like we're touching on a sort of shared set of phenomena here that's not just mediated by people taking deeply psychoactive substances, but maybe something that can be accessed through a variety of media.
I mean, it also sounds like you're touching on there being like this long history as well of noticing that like somatic experiences are important in different cultures, like with the Buddhist and the rainbow body, which I'm not quite sure what the rainbow body is. So
I
I'll have to
honestly,
look
I'm
that
not even
up.
sure I know what that is either.
Uh, but there's also like some like earlier Western traditions as well focused on
Yeah.
somatic experiences. Maybe you could tell us a
Mhm.
bit about that.
Yeah, I think this has shown up in like a variety of Western traditions. I mean, where my mind goes is like to the Quakers as well, who got their name because of like they would quake, I guess, during prayer, during worship, like literally shaking. So I mean, this shows up in like a variety of ways. I think for me, what was most relevant was like tracing it to like the like early history of psychoanalysis where I'm still sort of like learning about this. As I mentioned before we started, like I have this big textbook on like the history and like practice of somatic psychotherapy that I've kind of been working through. But one of the sort of earliest examples is, I mean, before psychoanalysis became this kind of like insight oriented practice and tradition, it was working more with what Freud called the cathartic method. And so the idea was really that like traumatic experiences that people endured had a kind of like affect or emotional charge attached to them. And the work of psychoanalysis in that early day was to sort of discharge that emotional affect, to go for a kind of like experience of catharsis where whatever rage or grief or whatever was kind of under the surface, they would sort of elicit it through their therapy. And Freud actually used like physical touch was part of it. Like he would press on people's like foreheads and stuff to kind of stimulate
Hmm.
associations. So in a way it was like when it's where it started. And again, this is just kind of my sort of limited understanding of the history of psychoanalysis here. But from what I understand, where it started was this kind of, it was more primal in a way. And then I think like over time, like there were various kind of like political forces and psychoanalysis kind of wanted to become more mainstream, I guess, and acceptable to the medical, the kind of respectable, like buttoned up sort of medical establishment. They couldn't have people like crying and flailing and screaming and stuff during their sessions. Like this was like Victorian society. Like that was a little bit like fringe, and I think it would raise some eyebrows. So those were sort of some of the pressures that kind of move psychoanalysis away from that. And also, catharsis itself is not enough. Like I'm a firm believer that like it's not enough to just like release all your stuff. Like that doesn't really, like to me, that's not a sustainable practice of well-being. I think it requires more than that, right? Actually working on habits and changing patterns of behavior and thought and posture even. But anyway, back in that sort of early day, there was also this guy, Wilhelm Reich, who has a bit of a complex legacy. And if people are listening and know who Wilhelm Reich is, they might sort of, their minds might immediately go to sort of his like later years when he got kind of crazy and was sort of like getting into this theory of like universal energy he called orgone, and he was building like weather control devices, and he thought he could like cure cancer with these like copper like lined like orgone accumulators that he sort of designed. So he got a little bit wacky in his later years. It's a crazy story. Eventually the FDA like pursued him and prosecuted him for selling his devices, and he ended up dying in prison because he dodged court. But all that said, I think he did some genuinely groundbreaking work before things kind of took a slide for the weird, where he was sort of the kind of the main figure within the psychoanalytic movement that was kind of staying with bodily experience. And he had all these ideas around what he called like character armor, kind of like what I was describing earlier with like the ways that sort of like our experiences accumulate not just in our sort of psyches and our beliefs, but also they shape our bodies. And his sort of idea was like muscular tension, like accumulated muscular tension is how that sort of happens, is that subtly our bodies kind of develop patterns of chronic muscular tension that configure our experience in a certain way. They limit maybe the kinds of emotions we experience, the intensity with which we experience them. And so his methods were sort of to work more directly with the body to kind of stimulate like the release of that tension, often with very dramatic results. And if you read some of like his early reports, like his main body of work on this in a book called Character Analysis, or I think it was called The Function of the Orgasm. I don't remember. One of the two. But he describes very similar stuff to what these kind of psychedelic experiences look like, particularly the sort of like release like experiences. So he's kind of an example of a character that, like, to me, like the split of the body from the field of psychotherapy, I kind of trace it back to that moment when Reich sort of got exiled from this psychoanalysis community and started kind of going crazy. It's interesting because it's kind of this branching path. And then somatic psychotherapy basically developed as a field entirely outside of academia, like entirely away from psychoanalysis. in spite of them having sort of this like shared lineage. I forget what your question was. That was a little bit rambling.
No, that was fascinating. I mean, it's not every day that a major figurehead in psychology ends up dying in prison. That's some exciting stuff. Just switching gears just a little bit, what do you hope, I guess, clinicians today learn from your work? Or how do you see all of this being applied, perhaps?
Yeah, I think of it as like sort of like to me, kind of two big insights from this project. And one of them sort of points back towards psychedelic assisted therapy. And the other to me is kind of like a broader, maybe more ambitious mission around like how we understand like embodiment in health and disease. For the first kind of more narrow case for psychedelic assisted therapy is that I think we really ought to consider that it's often not insight that heals, but enactment. That, like, I think people get the sense from these accounts that, like, expression is often not optional. Like, that part of people's healing process is that they need to express things that have been denied passage in them on some level. Whether that's finally crying over some lost parent or whatever, where you never properly got to grieve it, you kind of just moved on, or whether it's like finally expressing some expression of rage or whatever that feels like it's never had the opportunity to sort of, it's never been given permission. I just think that there are ways that there are certain natural functions of our body that our culture and our experiences kind of condition us out of in a way. Like, we think about, like, just being a child and having been getting told to, like, sit still in class and stop crying in public and don't do that and do this. It's just like there's a lot of directives that to me during our development, we kind of just like download those into our brains. And then we start to learn, oh, I'm not allowed to express in this way. I can express in this way. If I'm going to express anger, I have to do it this way. Like, there's a lot of rules that I think we start to kind of inherit from the world around us. And I think psychedelics, in some ways, create this opportunity to break those rules in the right setting. But I think like one of the big takeaways here is like we should create space for these experiences. And I think just as a matter of having the humility to know that we don't know how everybody's going to heal. We don't know what's going to be necessary for your healing process. It might be that sometimes people need to have a bizarre, inexplicable somatic experience, and we just need to be able to hold space for that. So I think rather than trying to massage everything into this like neat kind of like format that works with the way that we do things normally in the kind of therapy field, I think we need to have soft boundaries around that. And like, I think of one of my participants who he had this massive expression of anger vocally during one of his trips. And it only happened because one of the facilitators came over to him and saw him struggling with something. And she was like, you don't have to hold it in. And as soon as he heard that, this, like, he said it was like a dam breaking. Like, it was like this expression, very loud, like expression of anger came out. And that was like a threshold where he could kind of move into the next kind of phase of his trip where things kind of became more serene. So I wonder about whether we're denying people the opportunity to express things that might move them further along in their process. I think these accounts to me are like, I see them in some ways as like the fruiting body of like they're the most visible like piece of a more complex and like nuanced landscape of how our bodies take part in our healing process. It's just the most outward manifestation. Like, I'm just looking at observable bodily responses. But if you follow these stories back, you start almost like seeing all this like architecture and like all these ideas about like trauma kind of being held in the body and often having structure and age and location. And we haven't mapped any of this stuff. So I think that to me is kind of the broader point of like, why I'm really interested in this is not because of psychedelics. Like, it's because like I think this is a window into stuff that we haven't really considered as a field more generally.
It makes a lot of sense. Given that psychedelics are like non-specific amplifiers, of course you could amplify whatever sort of somatic experiences people might have in general from various emotions. One thing I'm like wondering about is if people are having really like big somatic experiences, like if I don't know, somebody just like trips at home and starts like, I don't know, doing any of like the spontaneous like aggression you were talking about. How can people better make sense of these experiences? Because I imagine it could be kind of jarring.
That's a good question. I would say I don't have an answer for how people can best make sense of them because I think it's different. There are common explanations, like the most common one you hear probably in the psychedelic underground is this kind of trauma release narrative that this is basically trauma being released from your body, whatever that means. That like something that's being held in the body in an unexpressed emotion or bound energy or unresolved trauma is sort of being released. So that's a common explanation. Like, I don't want to be in the role of like dictating how people should interpret these experiences. But what I will say is like to consider not resisting them, like, not, I don't know, it's nuance. Like, the truth is, like, I don't know if it's always all the time safe for people to be going there. Like, you might need to pump the brakes because maybe you're not ready for how big of a thing is coming up right now or maybe you don't feel like you're in the right setting for this to sort of come up. So most people's orientation that I interviewed was that even if they didn't know what this was about, that they were game to sort of follow it. That they kind of had a trust in, I guess, like it sounds kind of woo woo, and you hear this a lot in the psychedelic underground. They had a trust in their body's wisdom. That, like, even if I don't understand what this is or have a conceptual framework for it, it still feels like the right thing to do to kind of follow it. And often it's interesting because people have like very like kind of like elemental or like simple language and how they would describe it. Like it was often just like, it just felt right. It just felt natural. It just felt good. Like it just like, it's not that like, oh, I have to do this because this is trauma in my body and my trauma needs to release. And if I do that, then I'll have more energy or whatever. Like it was more just like, no, it just felt right, even if I couldn't explain it. So I think the kind of take home here is like, I don't know, like not to sort of like to invite, like if the body starts shaking during something, like consider whether it's worth just like inviting that experience rather than seeing it sort of as a side effect, like actually attend to it and explore it and get curious about it. Cause I think we too often sort of like, if your mindset is that when I go into a psychedelic experience, this is about me communing with God or having this particular kind of insight or exploration, I think you're more likely to ignore features like that, which could potentially lead you down like a fruitful avenue. But again, like I'm not like honestly, like I don't know that I would encourage everybody at home who has an experience like this to really go into it. Like there could potentially be risks in doing so. It could bring a lot up. Like it might also be that like, maybe there's something big that's connected to, and it might not be that you have the right support to explore that. So I don't know. It's kind of shrouded in uncertainty.
Wow. There's so much work you have to do now, or the field has to do now. Like, there's just so many possible directions. What do you dream like the next steps could be for this sort of research
Yeah.
agenda, I suppose?
Yeah, I kind of feel like I'm just like scattering like all of these like seeds to the wind right now. Like I want to be more discriminate about it, but like I'm at the phase of this research where like multiplicity is like the main theme here. It's like I really feel like it's like there is a lot of complexity. And if it's hard to track what I'm saying, like part of it is just because that's just how it is. Like the data is rich. There's like a ton of stuff here, many different avenues. I think for me, some of the like further work I would want to do is there's a lot of different ways I could take it. One of them is to like maybe like sort of create a more refined kind of general typology. Is that the word typology of these sort of or taxonomy of these kinds of experiences? I focused right now sort of on the types of stories people tell about them, but I wonder, but like how I define those may not be the most, may not be the best way to sort of understand kind of the diversity of somatic experiences. So, like, I think like creating a more refined like taxonomy of these things, and also maybe seeing if they're, I talked about this kind of almost like architecture that starts to emerge in some of these accounts, seeing if there's like consistency in the kinds of things people report about that rather than it just being like highly individual. Like, are specific emotions, like, do they tend to sort of surface in similar areas? Do certain psychological themes seem to associate with certain somatic expressions? Like, commonly, one thing that you kind of hear in the psychedelic sort of underground is that left side represents the feminine and right side represents the masculine. So sometimes people who I've talked to who are like experiencing shaking on the right side, one woman who I interviewed then went into this like profound grieving around her, like her father who passed away. And she sort of understood this as like the right side, maybe being associated with the masculine. And this is kind of stuff you hear a lot. And so I wonder, like, is there like, does that have legs? Could we potentially sort of understand that? Like, I think again, like there's a tendency to want to discount all of this stuff because like it sounds kind of unscientific on the surface because it is. But like I personally resist that tendency towards just like discarding things because they sound a certain way. Like there's I don't know, it's fringe and it's hard to measure, but I also trust that when you get a signal this loud, it's not just a bunch of people being stupid, you know? Maybe it is. I'm inclined to believe that it's not, that there's something here that they're pointing to that we just don't have good language or measurement tools. Which brings me to the second thing, which is to start to try and develop measurement tools for measuring somatic experiences. I think one of the most obvious ones to do, because it was the most prominent theme, is can we create a tool that measures this kind of release-like somatic experience? Is this an independent sort of contributor towards people's outcomes on psychedelics? Like if you have this kind of release like somatic experience, is it, for example, distinct from emotional breakthrough? I would say it's probably related to emotional breakthrough, but I don't know if they're one and the same. And does it correlate with, I don't know, like improved body awareness, for example? Like if it's true that like this is like the material of like trauma sort of working its way through the body, and trauma is related with dissociation and bodily disconnection, then like does having this kind of release like somatic experience actually reconnect people with their bodies? So that's kind of one idea that I have. That's kind of one of the more concrete ideas that I have. But I think it gets a lot more complicated from there. Like the release like experience is, I think, maybe the most actionable, but like the kind of like blurry, like meaning making through the body, like I don't know, like it gets really fuzzy after that. So I'm still like in the process of like figuring out what the next steps are, but I feel like I'm pretty committed to developing some kind of program of research around this and hopefully inspiring other researchers to like, yeah, get interested in this too, because I think there's a lot here. And to me, it's a whole other frame for understanding what psychedelics do.
It's so great when you just kind of stumble onto something that's not really a huge topic, and then you see that it's more and more complex. And yeah, I do agree that it could be its whole own like research subfields.
I do feel like this is kind of like a whole field of research, which is why when I'm trying to talk about it, it's very hard to find like a clear sort of like, like a single story to tell about it because it's just so complex.
Was there anything else that you hope our listeners sort of take away about somatic experiences, psychedelics, and all of that?
I just hope I just hope to inspire a curiosity about these things because like again, like there's this kind of pairing between this subject and like woo woo and fringe and sort of like this desire to kind of like discard these kind of, I don't know, or distance the science of psychedelics from this kind of more vibey, like less rigorous world. And I want to resist that urge. And I want to encourage other folks in the field to resist that urge and to take people's accounts here more seriously, which doesn't mean to believe them outright or to, you know, attribute more rigor or reality to them than is warranted, but just to actually get curious because there is no, we don't know what we're doing. Like none of us really know how this works, you know? Like, I think we should have the humility to approach all sides of this with the same degree of rigor and concern and open-mindedness. And I don't wanna see the field like, the irony of this to me is that psychedelics seem to sort of they seem to kind of, like, blur our mind-body duality, while the field itself seems to kind of be replicating it. Which to me is like, that's a problem. Like, we shouldn't walk into that paradox. Like, I think there's an opportunity here for psychedelic research to contribute to like a broader project in the science of healing and the science of psychology and medicine. And I think to like not leave that door open would be a mistake. I don't know if that was
Fantastic. Yes, yes, it was. Well, thank you so much for coming on today.